مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الفوضى والشر، الشر والفوضى، هذان هما نجما السياسة الخارجية في 2015. من ناحية أرادت الدولة الإسلامية للعالم وجها جديدا للشر. ليس من السهل ارتكاب جرائم أسوأ من بشار الأسد أو بوكو هرام أو جيش الرب للتحرير، ولكن داعش تسعى جاهدة لأن تصير أكثر الجماعات الإرهابية وهشية وأكثرها ألمية على مر التاريخ. من ناحية أخرى تنتشر الفوضى بدأ من الدول المنهارة في الشرق الأوسط. الخرائط التي أعيد رسمها بعد انهيار الاتحاد السوفيتي قبل قرابة 25 عاما ربما يتعين أما قريب إعادة رسمها من جديد، إذ تبدو البلدان في طريقها إلى التفكك. لربما أشد من يقلق حقيقة عن العالم بزعامة الولايات المتحدة ما يزال يبحث عن إجابات فعالة لهاتين المشكلتين. هل سيأتي العام الجديد بتلك الإجابات أم إنه سيأتي بمزيد من الشر والفوضى؟ لمناقشة تحديات السياسات الخارجية الأميركية خلال العام الأخير من رئاسة أوباما، يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس وبول ساندرز. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with our panel of foreign policy experts to discuss 2015 and what 2016 holds in store. So, gentlemen, let's first just talk for a minute about the year that was. 2015 began with terrorism in Paris, ended with terrorism in Paris and in California. How prominent on the global stage is the theme of terrorism in terms of dominating the agenda? Dennis?
I think it is dominating the agenda, and ironically, it seems to be a focal point for almost everyone. Certainly in Europe now, there's a preoccupation with it in a way that there wasn't, even though you would have thought after Charlie Hebdo there would have been. We now are completely consumed by it. It seems to be the dominant theme here. For someone like Vladimir Putin, it is, it's sort of a theme that he's trying to promote as a way of also presenting himself on the world stage as the leader in terms of dealing with it. So almost everywhere you look, you're seeing it. I think you see it somewhat in China as well. I mean, so I think it's a theme that seems to be recognized everywhere. It's one of these classic global issues where it seems to know no borders.
Paul?
I would certainly agree with that. At the same time, we're clearly still facing, at least with some countries, significant differences over definitions of what's terrorism and what isn't terrorism. And certainly in the case of what's happening in Syria and Russia's role there versus the role of some others. This is just an ongoing challenge. It's certainly nothing new in the world of terrorism, but a problem that I think is very much still going to be with us in 2016.
Now, we're already seeing this have a political impact with the success of the far right in France, with Putin being resuscitated a certain bit on the global stage. If you think about 2016, where do you think that trend may be headed?
Well, I think that's very much likely to continue, and certainly in the case of Russia, I think, as Ambassador Ross said, Vladimir Putin sees this as an important international political opportunity for Russia. I think it's very notable that the Russian government for quite some time after the bombing of the plane coming out of Egypt over the Sinai was reluctant to define it as terrorism. But in the immediate aftermath of the attacks in Paris, Russia very quickly decided that it was a terrorist attack, and that fully reflects the political nature of terrorism and the kind of dialogue surrounding it.
You mean they recognize it as an opportunity?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That it was a clear opportunity where before Paris, I think for Moscow, the downing of the Egyptian plane could look like a cost of its policy in Syria. After the attacks in Paris, look at us. We're also victims like everyone else. We should also unite.
Mm-hmm. And where does this go? This return of Putin to legitimacy, this strengthening of the far right and certainly the center right in Europe.
Well, it's not clear. I mean, on the one hand, I think there's something interesting about what Paul was saying in terms of Putin finally identifying what had happened to the Russian passenger plane. I think he did see it as a way of making common cause in Europe, as a way of also shifting the attention away from Ukraine. He certainly would like to see those sanctions lifted. And I think the Europeans themselves may be inclined, even though I don't think there's going to be an immediate change, but I think they're certainly looking at the Russians as more and more as a possible partner. You know, here they are, they're facing threats coming out of Syria. The Russians are saying, look, we're prepared, we're in the Vienna process, we're prepared to play this role. There is a problem in terms of Syria, in terms of how you define who's a terrorist and who isn't, and that may really develop, that may befuddle, I think, this process and derail the process in Vienna. But there's no question that you have a political dynamic in Europe now that is being very much driven by how do you respond to terror. We see it in our country too. I mean, you suddenly see the polls here where the terror issue now is eclipsing the economy as a political issue. And the sense of people being more anxious than they were, it goes back to being the equivalent of the period after 9/11, at least in terms of polling right now. So I think this is a phenomenon that we're all going to have to deal with, and how you position yourself to deal with it, how you frame the nature of the response to it, I think is going to be very much what we will see shaping 2016.
Now, both of you mentioned Syria, and a lot of the diplomacy and the differences between us and our various international partners comes down to the negotiations over Syria. You referred to the Vienna process. Everybody says they want it to succeed, but everyone's interests seem to be in very different directions. What's your crystal ball tell you about the success or failure of the Vienna process? Do we have shared interests that really will manifest themselves in 2016?
I think it's possible. I think it'll depend to a large extent on events, and it's very clear that the key issue is the fate of President Assad, and whether his role in the government of Syria is something that should be excluded as a condition for having negotiations, or something that should be decided as a part of a negotiating process. That's the big obstacle right now. Certainly, I think we're seeing in the United States and also in Europe more and more politicians, as distinct from government officials, more and more politicians who are beginning to crack a little bit in the sense that they're starting to talk about, well, maybe we should defer this issue of Assad and Assad's role. I think that's really at the core of it this year, and we'll see how events play out.
Yeah. Look, I think there's not just the question of Assad. Assad is the focal point of the difference, and there's no question there's been an evolution on the European side and ours. Whereas before we were saying he had to go, now we're saying, well, there's a transition, and when he goes is less important than how the transition plays out. That said, I think the real question is going to be, is the ceasefire enforced or not? If this is going to be a diplomatic process that goes anywhere, it depends entirely on whether or not the ceasefire is enforced. And that really comes back to the Russians, because the Assad regime, the Iranians and Hezbollah, whether they will actually live by the ceasefire and force a ceasefire, I think that is a very big question mark. And I think the only one who has leverage on them to get them to stop would be the Russians. If they don't, then you're going to see the Saudis and the others, you're going to see them continue to be pouring assistance in there, along with Turkey. And I think that just keeps what's going on very much on the same path. From the U.S. standpoint, we seem to be thinking we can persuade through logic, an approach here. And I think that would be fine if the world was based on logic. I suspect that leverage is a better way to think about how to approach these issues than the idea of logic.
I certainly would agree with that. I think that's entirely correct. It's an interesting question how Russia and its position will evolve in the coming year. There are a lot of factors that are going to be involved, I think, in looking at that. I do think that we're starting actually to see statements coming out of Moscow that that the Russian military is supporting ground attacks by the Free Syrian Army against ISIS. Now, the validity of the claims, I'm not in a position to evaluate.
These are the same people that they were bombing a couple of weeks ago.
Correct. But they are now. They're now Russian government officials saying that they are supporting them. Certainly, the Russian government has been going through its own process of reaching out to the Syrian opposition and trying to make its own determination of kind of who is responsible opposition and who is irresponsible opposition in Syria. And we'll see. They certainly seem to be looking for an angle, another angle, that will allow them to reframe what's happening.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting. I saw that as well. Mm-hmm. That they're saying they're providing air cover mm-hmm. and even materiel, which is something we haven't seen before. We haven't seen those in the Free Syrian Army saying they're getting that. Mm-hmm. Look, this will play out pretty soon, because there's also a debate over who is a terrorist and who isn't a terrorist. You were suggesting that before, mm-hmm. but it's also if you're actually going to have a negotiation, the Saudis convened this large group of the opposition, and they've included those who are armed fighters who would be represented in 32 members who would go and be part of the negotiating process. Now we'll see, are the Russians going to accept that? Clearly we know where Assad and the Iranians have been coming from. So this becomes, we'll have some very early tests to see what the real position is, not just what the rhetoric is, but what the real position is.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about the actor who really hasn't played much in this conversation, namely President Barack Obama, and where American policy is and is going to be going over on these issues in 2016. Again, our panel of foreign policy experts includes Paul Saunders. Paul is the executive director of the Center for National Interest and director of its program on U.S.-Russian relations, as well as other projects on energy, climate change, and U.S.-Japan relations. He is also associate publisher of the foreign policy magazine, The National Interest. Paul served in the administration of President George W. Bush as senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, focusing on Russia, Ukraine, and the former Soviet Union, as well as issues related to Iraq, China, and India. A frequent media commentator, Paul is the editor of Costs of a New Cold War, the U.S.-Russia confrontation over Ukraine, and enduring rivalry, American and Russian perspectives on the former Soviet space. Sitting to his left is Dennis Ross, my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which he rejoined after 3 years in the Obama administration, first in the State Department and then as senior director for the Central Region on the National Security Council. Dennis has 25 years' experience at high levels in government, including White House tours in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. He is the author most recently of Doomed to Succeed, U.S.-Israel Relations from Truman to Obama. So let's pick up with Obama. The president gave a major Oval Office address after the attacks in San Bernardino, adding urgency to American policy on terrorism, but he didn't actually add much substance to the American counterterrorism fight. Do you expect any significant change in how the president approaches this issue in 2016?
Yeah, I don't, unless events force a change. I mean, the president has been so hesitant to be involved in Syria because he's seen throughout that this is, in his mind, somehow a new Iraq. I mean, he's looked at our involvements in Iraq and Afghanistan. He sees, in his mind, what are only quagmires. He sees enormous cost. He sees very little gain. And he's convinced that he has a concept of strategic patience, which is, you know, if we just wait this out, you know, we will position ourselves better. You know, he said, you know, he was elected to get us out of Middle East wars, not into them. He doesn't think we should be involved in someone else's civil war. And he's been sort of grudgingly dragged into this step by step against what I think are his own instincts that would otherwise lead him in a different direction. So I think the hesitancy that we've seen throughout is something that will continue unless there is some dramatic event, which there could be. I mean, we could yet have some other kind of event that the president, in effect, would have his hand forced. And so unless there's something that is really dramatic that changes, I don't believe that you'll see any real change in our policy other than incremental moves.
And if the policy stays more or less the same, how does that affect America's ability to shape events in a conflict like the Syria-Iraq zone?
You know, certainly it's limited, and it remains limited. I would agree broadly with what Ambassador Ross said. I think the U.S. policy, the administration's policy in Syria is defined really more by what the president doesn't want to do or wants to avoid than what he does want to do. So certainly in the military area, there are not only constraints on the type of involvement that the president wants to have, but there are also very restrictive rules of engagement. If you look at the diplomatic track, I think it's defined largely by what the president doesn't want to do. If you look at arming the opposition, I think it's defined primarily by what the president doesn't want to do. And it leaves us, I think, candidly with a policy which is composed of the pieces that are left over after many key options have been ruled out or sharply limited. Certainly, I sympathize with the president and with the administration in the sense that it's a very challenging problem. And it's not easy to say that, you know, greater use of force or a kind of less deliberate process of arming the opposition, you know, would automatically produce the outcomes we want. It's a complicated situation. But I think it is very clear that when the President of the United States telegraphs disinterest in a problem and therefore reduces expectations on the part of governments and others in the region about what the United States might do, it dramatically reduces their incentives to do things that satisfy our preferences and priorities.
diplomatically put, I believe.
Well, I think there is a reality in this region that if the United States takes a step back, it helps to create vacuums, and we see who fills those vacuums. And when we bemoan, the Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, who's a very good guy, he was bemoaning the fact on the Hill that the Sunnis are not stepping forward and doing as much as we would like them to do. But they're going to be hesitant to take real steps as long as they feel exposed, and they're going to be hesitant to take real steps if it looks like they're in league with those who are engaging in an onslaught on Sunnis. We ratchet up as we should what we're doing against ISIS at the very time that the Russians are still primarily hitting the non-ISIS opposition. So it looks like an onslaught on Sunnis.
Okay, well, thank you both gentlemen very much. Thank you for helping to close out 2015 and helping launch us into the new year.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول احتمالات إنهاء القتال في سوريا في 2016 أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.